Régis, it's great to see you today.
Good morning.
So you've been living in Tbilisi, Georgia for already 22 years, and you've been working for the French news for all this time. But recently you had a book come out on a different topic, specifically looking at Donald Trump's ties to Russia. And you say that goes back years and years. And in fact, it might have ties to the Russian Mafia. What'd you find out?
Yeah, I mean, what I find out, it was found out before by a lot of researchers, journalists, investigators from the FBI or from the press in the US since many years. Quite recently, basically, because for years nobody investigated what were the relations between Trump and the Russians, and it mostly happened after 2015, and when we saw that Russia was really involved in trying to influence the US elections when Trump was elected. But indeed, these relations are going back in the 70s even. The first wife of Mr. Trump was a Czech citizen, top model at the time, and of course, it was a socialist Czechoslovakia. So when she was going back to her country with the son of Donald Trump and her three kids, of course, the local security was monitoring her. And this is how Mr. Trump became in the radar of not only the Czech security, but also the KGB, because the Czech security was a kind of daughter company of the KGB at the time. And then it started mostly in the 80s, indeed through the Red Mafia, which emigrated in the 70s from USSR, mostly from Odessa, from Ukraine, and moving to Brighton Beach in New York. And Trump and his family, his father, who are never looking very much where the money was coming from, started to work with these people. And we have information that also the KGB was interested in Trump, and it happened that finally they organized a kind of special operation to invite Mr. Trump in Moscow in July 87. And a few weeks after Mr. Trump came back to the US, he bought for $94,000, 3 pages in the New York Times, Boston Globe, and Washington Post to publish an open letter saying that, we should stop to finance the defense of the European countries, the NATO members, and Japan. Exactly what he still says now. So you see how it is. And since 87, I think he never really said seriously anything wrong about Russia. And we understand that probably he was cultivated. He was not an agent of the KGB, but he is what some people from the intelligence community in the US called, and they said this is how the KGB is calling Trump a confidential contact. So it is someone which is not paid to bring information or to do some work of influence, but it's someone that you cultivate, that you help to become more well-known, to have some views, to be more exposed, or to be helped financially through different people. For example, the mafia. Every time Mr. Trump was about to have a bankruptcy in his businesses, it happened about 7 times. Every time you could see some Russian Soviet money coming around him through the mafia. 15 people from the mafia, for example, at some point bought or rented a flat in the Trump Tower. Of course, there was also laundering their money in the casinos of Mr. Trump. And it became, mafia is not just a mafia. And this is what I brought because I'm first a specialist of Russia. The Russian mafia or the Soviet mafia is absolutely linked. It's like consubstantial to the secret services or the security services. The mafia doesn't have its own life aside of the security services. So through that, they managed to cultivate Trump for 40 years and probably have a president which is somehow our man in Washington from Moscow point of view.
So looking back historically, what is the relationship between the KGB or the Soviet authorities and the Russian mafia? And does that relationship still exist today as it did 40 years ago?
Yeah, it exists. It still exists today. And the biggest, the kind of Al Capone from the Soviet Union, Russia, which is Semyon Mogilevich, is still living very quietly in Moscow, as far as I know now. And it is coming back from the Gulag. this is in the Gulag that finally the relation between the two became very strong. Because the police authorities, the police in charge of the control of the Gulag at the Soviet time under Stalin, were using the criminal world, the underworld, let's say, to achieve some things. For example, to eradicate the Trotskyists in the camps, in the gulags, and so on. So it became a long relation, and it changed over the time in the 70s, and then after the collapse of Soviet Union, because there was what we call the treasure of the Soviets, which are billions of dollars, which were decided to be put out of Russia. So somewhere in the West, it was an initiative from the KGB, but for that they did have to rely on businessmen, mafioso, red mafia, and so on. And at that time, even some experts would say that finally this is not the KGB was controlling the mafia, but it changed and the mafia started to control the KGB. So the links are still very strong. And we can see from time to time some companies, some people very rich, very influential, and some of them were around Mr. Trump. For example, in 2015, 16, which have this double background. Both they are coming from the mafia. Sometimes they were born even in Brighton Beach in some such families. And in the meantime, they would have contact at a very high level with the security services in Russia.
Now that Trump has been president one time, it seems there's a very good chance they'll become president a second time. What do you think Russia is hoping to see?
I think Russia is hoping to see exactly the opposite that officially what Mr. Putin says, because he was asked at the beginning of the year, who do you want, Biden or Trump? And he said Biden because he is more predictable. But as I said already in 87, Trump was saying exactly what Moscow wanted to hear. Russia, US should stop to finance NATO members. And this is the obsession of Mr. Putin to defend the interest of Russia and so on. So Trump is very predictable in this regard. And obviously this is what they want. What Mr. Putin, what the Kremlin wants is Trump to be elected. Not because they like Trump, not because they trust him as such, but because they think that at least he will have an isolationist agenda in foreign policy. So they will, let's say, US will less bother the Russia in, for example, it's near abroad, in Ukraine, in the Caucasus, in the Balkans, and so on. And also because they think that Trump will finally undermine what makes the strength of the US, or partly what makes the strength of US, which is also its political regime, its democracy. And this is very important because if you want to analyze why a country is a dictatorship, as Russia or authoritarian regime, you have to look also at how works the power, the internal, I mean, how works politics internally in the country. And Russia is not a democracy, and to protect themselves as an authoritarian or authoritarian regime or dictatorship, they have also to have around them some non-democratic countries. And this is why Mr. Putin is always helping, I don't know, Yanukovych in Ukraine back in 2013, or Lukashenko in Belarus, or Bashar al-Assad in Syria. You know, it's not an absolute rule, but usually the dictatorship prefer to deal with dictatorship, while the democracies prefer, usually, not always, but deal with democracy. So I think this is why it's important to get Trump there. They feel that, Putin sometimes has a kind of religious vision of the world. I don't think he's believing it at all, but at least this is the grammar he's using. And somehow he would see Trump as an antichrist, someone who would come and destroy the US. I think this is the dream of Mr. Putin. Not to destroy the US, because in many regards, the US is a model for Mr. Putin. It's the model of power, of superpower that he is dreaming about. But at least it's a country that prevents Russia to be able to keep all its alliances in the world, in the Balkans, in Serbia, and so on. And it prefers to have US weakened.
So when you saw the interaction between Putin and Trump when they met together in Helsinki during Trump's first term, What'd you make of it?
If you remember the images of Mr. Trump in Helsinki back in 2018, it was the second time that Putin and Trump met face to face. And when Mr. Trump is usually, very dominating, giving orders, saying things, in this case, he was really as a little child. He had his hands like this, and was just listening to Mr. Putin. And it was very strange to see that.
So you've probably noticed Donald Trump seems to really admire Vladimir Putin. What do you make of that? And what have you noticed about it during this campaign?
Yeah, you're right. It goes back far ahead, and it's not only about Putin. It looks like a cliche, but I think it's not. Mr. Trump has an admiration for strong men, for the will, for the people who can have a will and decide, say something, and then implement it immediately. So he's this kind of leader. This is why he doesn't care so much about democracy. In 84, he had suddenly the ambition to become the top negotiator between Washington and Moscow for the nuclear disarmament under the Reagan administration. And he talked about that. And a journalist came to him. He gave first Mr. Trump gave an interview to Playboy magazine, because to speak about such a serious issue as nuclear weapons, you have to give an interview to a serious magazine. So it was Playboy. And then he gave an interview to a journalist who took him quite seriously, and he gave an interview in a nightclub somewhere in New York. And but Trump looked serious about that. And the journalist said, "How will you do if you become the top negotiator for Mr. Reagan? How will you do?" And he had to answer. And at some point he said, for the small countries like Pakistan or France, we'll put them the pressure, we'll put sanctions till the point that they will give up their nuclear weapon. And the big countries, USSR, US, will just deal together. So again, it was exactly what Moscow wanted to hear at the time, to deal as a kind of equal with the US, while they were far beyond, of course, but on a much less powerful, and it's especially true now with Russia. But the idea was to deal just with big powers, and we understand that he has no interest for the small countries. Their interest should not be taken into account for him. So this is part, I think, of the admiration he has for Mr. Putin. Plus, probably some tight, and he can't say everything, and he has to kind of be submitted to Mr. Putin.
So when Trump and Putin did meet in Helsinki, why is it that Trump was so abashed? He seemed nervous. He seemed that he was looking away. It seemed that the senior partner in the relationship was undoubtedly Putin. But why is Trump sort of afraid of Putin? Does Putin perhaps have information about Trump, like compromat? Or what do you think it is?
Difficult to say. I think it's something like a compromat, but not the one we spoke about, during the 2015-16 campaign with the Christopher Steele investigation, which was about the so-called golden shower, which is a kind of sexual practice that Mr. Trump would have in an hotel in Moscow. This is wrong. This is probably wrong, and I have several sources confirming that this is probably wrong. And it's even worse. Probably this compromat about sexual issues was probably planted by the FSB in the investigation. Probably because they knew that the investigation would be powerful, that it would come, whatever they do. So they had to try to spoil it. And while we would speak about golden showers, we would not speak about the most important things, money. And money comes, we spoke about the Red Mafia, and it plays a big role, obviously. A lot of money came through Mr. Trump at the important moment when he was about to have a bankruptcy. I should also recall what happened with a billionaire, Russian one, very close to the Kremlin, who back in 2008 bought his Palm Beach villa for $95 million. Mr. Trump bought that villa of Palm Beach 4 years earlier for 41. So the benefit was $50 million. In between these 4 years, 2004, 2008, the market, the real estate market remained more or less stable, and Mr. Trump didn't invest anything in this villa. I mean, he didn't really do some work on it and so on. So it was a kind of present of $50 million. 2008, financial crisis time. and so on. It also comes from the Deutsche Bank. The Deutsche Bank has a very strange practices with Mr. Trump, giving loans to him while everybody knew in New York that there was the Donald risk. And we knew that he was not paying back his debt, his loans, and so on. And despite this, the Deutsche Bank lended a lot of money to him, billion, and about $1 billion, even more, I think. And this is very strange. And we see also the very close relation that for that years in the 90s, 2000s, but Deutsche Bank had with Russia. Very strong relation. So it was probably or possibly a way also for Russia to help. And we know that there was, and I try to show that in my book, that there was very possibly close contact between the head of one Russian bank, the VTB, and Mr. Trump, organized by the Kremlin. So we see, we don't have the final proof, but we see the relation, how they could happen. So the compromise is more probably about the money, the way that 40 years as a confidential contact, Mr. Trump was cultivated by the Russians, not as an agent, not as a puppet, but as someone we can talk to.
So outside from the United States, which is having its elections very soon, other countries in Eastern Europe are also having elections. In Moldova, they were last weekend, and this upcoming weekend, Georgia is also having elections. And it seems that Russia is certainly trying to influence the outcomes there. What do you make of the situation?
Yeah, that's for sure. I would make difference between Moldova and Georgia. Moldova is a different country because historically, the way that country was built after the Second World War was kind of buffer zone. So the population is in between. You know, partly you have pro-Russian people. Historically, you have some strongholds in the country of pro-Russian people. For example, in the city of Belts, which is a city where there was industries from the military industry factories. So it remains sociologically some kind of pro-Russian stronghold. Also, you have some ethnic region. I'm thinking about Gagauzia, for example. So it's not a surprise that it is quite balanced. And finally, the result of the referendum was about 50-50 pro for Europe and 50 against. It's not a big surprise, but indeed Russia tried to influence the outcome, and also for the presidential election. And Mrs. Sandu, the president, outgoing president, is not certain to win the election at the beginning of November. Partly because of the Russian influence, and they try to buy some votes to pay the people to vote for against Madame Sandu, but it doesn't explain everything. Also, it's also because of probably Madame Sandu didn't manage to also reach that people. It's difficult, of course, but the economical situation is difficult in Moldova. The price hike of the gas was really important this last years, and it was Europe tried to help, but it was not easy. So this is the situation. But indeed, for Russia, despite the country is very small, it's really important. Every former Soviet republic is important for Russia because it gives also the message to everyone, to Ukraine, to Kazakhstan, to Armenia, to Belarus, but also to the West, that, you know, you should not continue to resist to Russia. Let's give to Russia what it wants, the control of its near abroad. And Georgia is the same, but the population is different in Georgia. We don't have this split 50-50 between pro-Russian and pro-European, let's say. Mostly because in the opinion polls, and since 20 years, I'm reading the same opinion polls in Georgia, we don't see much pro-Russian. You could have some Georgians who would be cautious. They say, we don't want NATO or we don't want Europe, but they are a minority because it's too dangerous. It would provoke Russia, but it doesn't mean that they are pro-Russian. So the Georgian government is different because now it's an oligarch who made all his, Bidzina Ivanishvili, who made all his money in Russia. And for me, who works about the Russian elites, I can tell you that I don't know a single example of an oligarch or former oligarch in Russia who made his money in Russia or with Russia that can be totally independent from the Kremlin. it's a case in Ukraine. I mean, Akhmetov, the richest man in Ukraine for long, was a Russian ally. And now it's still not totally clear, in my opinion. Of course, with the war, he has to side more with Kiev, of course. But you should remember his behavior at the very beginning of the war back in 2014, for example. So Mr. Ivanishvili is totally is a kind of prisoner of Russia. He made his money there, so he owes something to Russia, in the opinion of the Kremlin. And what I say is not exceptional. Everywhere where you have a dictatorship, a strong one, you can't see any billionaire living independently from the power. Imagine that Jack Ma in China can fly with his own wings. It's just impossible. As soon as he tries, he's punished for that. So the same in Russia. For Ivanishvili, he's tied by Russia, probably, and it is important because Georgia is a small country, but we should never forget that the war in Ukraine started in Georgia. This is the same war back in 2008. The first war out of the borders of Russia, of Mr. Putin, was in Georgia back in 2008, for exactly the same reason that now we have the war in Ukraine. And the key issue is Europe. The day that Yanukovych pushed by Mr. Putin, came back to Kiev to say, okay, we forget about the association agreement, then Maidan started and so on, and we know the result. What is at stake in Georgia today? Becoming member of European Union. So this election of this Saturday, next Saturday, is a kind of referendum, as you say, properly, indeed, of do we want Europe or not? The population wants, 80% of the Georgians, they say that they want to become European. So the government, under the rule of Mr. Ivanishvili, try to explain that they are pro-European because they can't say the opposite. If they would do, they would have Maidan, as Yanukovych get it. So they have to say, we are pro-European, but we don't want this Europe. And they try to jeopardize the relation, or to destroy the relation between Georgia and the West, but not by saying no to Europe. Again, this is what Yanukovych says, and you have Maidan in this case, but by trying to push Europe to say no to Georgia. Mm-hmm. This is why, for example, they used the LGBT issue, which is since 2012, I would say, which is a geopolitical weapon, tool, and which is used, to try to cultivate the segment of the society which is more or less traditionalist. It's not so important, but they try to use that to say, Europe means decadence, Europe means homosexuality, and so on. Exactly the Russian narrative since 2 centuries, basically. And they try also they created a narrative back in 2022, saying that Europe and the West wants to open a second front of the Ukrainian war in the Caucasus. So they use the fear of the war to try to push the population to vote for Mr. Ivanishvili and finally to vote, but they are not aware about that, but for a pro-Russian program.
That was fascinating. I really appreciate you taking time to talk with us today. Have a great day.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.